we're looking at politics tonight. People have asked me in the past, they said, would you be interested in doing videos on politics, government, history, things like that? And on my other channel, which Google discourages people from doing 2 channels, I did 2 videos about history, and then I deleted them later. I didn't think they were that great. I mean, I thought the content was good, but I didn't like the production quality so much. So tonight we're going to look at politics, and I will do more from time to time, and I'd like to have people interact. Just relaxing tonight, not doing anything too much, getting ready to, we're going to watch Monday Night Football, I think. Drinking Smithwick's Pale Ale, which I've been enjoying. Got those 8-packs, $4.99. I bought so many of those 8-packs when they had that super sale. But anyway, the topic for tonight is old right versus new right, paleo conservative versus neoconservative. And if you watch the news ever, or listen to talk radio or read, you'll hear a lot about conservatism. The conservatives say this, say that, whatever. Usually what you're hearing about these days is neoconservatism, or the new right, as you'll see it called in history books. But it's a lot different than the old right. Okay, there are some similarities, but let's try to break it down a little bit. I'll try to break it down, and if anybody has comments, feel free to comment. First, we'll look at the new right, because that's what people are more familiar with, neo or new conservatism. Ronald Reagan is a good exemplification of this. Rush Limbaugh. And there are different variants or factions of new conservatism too, so it's not a monolithic thing. But this goes back, really, we could go back to around the time of the New Deal, okay? The New Deal was instituted by the Roosevelt administration, Democratic administration, 1933. The old-time conservatives, which we'll get to in a little while, they very strongly opposed the New Deal. They opposed Social Security, Works Progress Administration, minimum wage, all these types of things. They said it was they said it was unnecessary, and secondly, they said it was a big encroachment by the U.S. government on the rights of individuals and states. All right. And most Americans supported the New Deal. Okay, Roosevelt was elected 4 times, and he eventually had a very strong majority. Well, he had a very strong majority in Congress. All right, not eventually, but from when he took office in March '33. This is not about Roosevelt, but after the war, 1945, there started to be a big breakdown with the New Deal supporters. You had people that, and a big part of the controversy was centering around the influence of communism in the U.S. government. Okay, the liberals, like now you had liberals that opposed Roosevelt and Truman. They thought they were too confrontational with the Soviet Union, and you had third parties on the left, Progressive Party running against Truman, saying that they were too conservative. Then you had Truman, which was sort of like the mainstream liberal, and then you had other liberals who felt that the Democratic Party was going too far to the left, and they were not addressing communism in the country. They were too hard, too in a rush to push civil rights legislation and whatnot. So people like Ronald Reagan, who was a New Deal liberal Democrat, head of the Screenwriters Guild in Los Angeles, and others, they quit the Democratic Party and joined the Republican Party, which they felt was not becoming as radical. Okay. At the same time, you had, and then this is going to get a little complicated, but we had the Soviet Revolution, the Russian Revolution, 1917. You had Stalin, who was more of an orthodox communist, And his idea was to first build up the industry of the Soviet Union, industrial might, the military, and then they could fight this world revolution down the road. You had Trotsky saying, no, 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 we have to have world revolution right now. Right now, we have to set off revolutions all around the world and all the industrialized countries. We have to support terrorist attacks all over in England, France, United States, whatever we have to do. Bring down the capitalist countries immediately. Stalin said, you're crazy, because if we were to do that, United States, Great Britain, France, and probably Germany, they would probably team up with their former enemy, Germany, Italy, etc. They would all, and Japan from the east, they would all immediately invade Russia. We're not strong yet. We would be destroyed. We'd all be killed. So what benefit would that, what would we achieve? So they kept arguing about it. Plus they were both power mad. You know, they wanted to be the dictator. Stalin had more people in the Communist Party in Russia agreeing with him. So he won out. He had most of the support of the Communist Party, and eventually Trotsky was sort of put down, and they said, you lose, so too bad. He kept promoting his ideas, though, the more radical communism. And he had a lot of followers in Russia who kept stirring up trouble. Or Stalin suspected that they were going to try some kind of a leftist revolution of the Communist Party. And most of Trotsky, who was Jewish, most of his followers were Russian Jews. And Stalin said, okay, well, fine. You want trouble? Well, I can give you a lot of trouble. Have no doubt. So then there was a huge crackdown, 1936, on the Trotskyites. And Trotsky fled to, fled Russia and eventually settled in Mexico. I have books by this lady, some other Russians, like this woman Ginsburg, who was a Russian communist. Her and her husband were arrested during the purges, and she stayed in prison camp until 1953. Luckily for her, she wasn't killed, because thousands and thousands of Russians were killed in the purges, many of them Jewish. So they fled. A lot of the Russian communist Jews fled to the United States, okay? And they were followers of Trotsky. Communists, but Trotskyite, as opposed to communist Stalinist. All right. Many of them wound up in the United States, and they began to have a lot of influence in the United States. And many of the Trotskyites started getting involved in politics over here. No surprise, right? And they had a big influence on the new right, modern conservatism, if you can imagine this. You can do some research on neoconservatism, and you'll notice that back in the early 50s, there was a strong Trotskyite influence. And that'll bring us up to the Bush administration. Bush administration had a lot of people, Richard Pearl, and the Pearl family. There's a father and a son, and then Irving Kristol and William Kristol. And they wanted to have these invasions of Iraq and confrontation with the war, countries around the world who were possibly supporting terrorism. And you had this worldwide American involvement and sort of disruption around the world. And many of the people who are critics of neoconservatism say, well, it goes along with the Trotskyite plan of this constant roiling revolutionary activity, conflict around the world to bring down, to sort of like crash the world structure, and then you rebuild communism from within. So you don't have to start it off from the Soviet Union. Now you start it off from the US, which is even stronger. Now that's part of it. That's not the whole thing. That's a big part of it. And you had Scoop Jackson, a Democrat, big supporter of in the 50s of Israel and whatnot. All right, now, so what do neoconservatives tend to support? Well, let's look at what they do support. or what they don't oppose. You will almost never see a neoconservative oppose the New Deal. That makes sense because they were supporters of the New Deal. You will never see neoconservatives oppose Medicare or Medicaid. Lyndon Johnson, liberal Democrats. That's a New Deal program. Okay, Medicare, Medicaid, and all of those things that Johnson, the war on poverty programs that Johnson started, they were just programs that Roosevelt never had enough votes to get passed, nor did Truman have enough votes to get passed. So really all the stuff that Kennedy was killed, so he couldn't get it passed, although he was having trouble getting that stuff passed while he was in office. This is all a continuation of the New Deal. So Truman had the fair deal, okay? He was trying to do Obamacare, we call it Obamacare, but they were trying to do this in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s. Even if you remember, Bill Clinton in '93 tried to get this passed. So all of these things are linked with the New Deal. So you had the original New Deal. Roosevelt had two parts to it, first and second New Deal. Then you had Truman continuing the New Deal. Kennedy and Johnson instituting a lot of what Roosevelt wanted 20 years before, and so on. Even Bush, the second, George Herbert Walker Bush in president from '89 to '93, he passed New Deal policies like the Americans with Disabilities Act. You'll see these neoconservatives usually support an increase of minimum wage. Reagan did so. You never saw Reagan trying to get rid of any New Deal programs, nor did Bush or the second Bush. All right. Now, Nixon doesn't really fit into the neoconservative program so much because Nixon is more like just a Republican liberal, very similar to Hubert Humphrey, Kennedy, Johnson, and Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a Republican liberal, and they expanded Eisenhower, but Eisenhower felt like the New Deal had gone a little too far, and he wanted to slow it down a little bit. He even balanced the budget 3 out of the eight years he was in office. But Nixon, to a large extent, was the acting president while Eisenhower was in office. Eisenhower was sickly. And then Nixon continued what Johnson did with the Great Society, because Johnson passed in all the Civil Rights Act of 64, 65, 68, the Fair Housing Act, and all that stuff. Nixon continuing on basically with the EPA. Nixon wanted to have a minimum, not minimum wage, a minimum income, and all of this. So but Nixon wasn't really a conservative. He was conservative in some ways, in the sense that he had some idea of traditional values. He wasn't a radical in that sense. But and then you had Carter, who was a mild liberal compared to Kennedy. Ted Kennedy was conservative, and Reagan and Bush and Clinton was moderate to left-wing liberal, and then Bush and the President Obama, who was more of an openly radical liberal, like say you would have with Truman or L.B. Johnson. But looking at foreign affairs now, we're looking at domestic there. Civil rights, they support civil rights acts, New Deal programs. Republicans and Democrats now. It's not people get hung up on running one against the other. Okay. Foreign affairs. Roosevelt was very, and we're talking about Franklin Roosevelt, very involved with involvement in foreign conflicts, World War II, all these things, Truman with Korea, and Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon with Vietnam. So you'll notice that the liberals in the old days supported big involvement in foreign conflicts, and the old conservatives, now we're getting into the old conservatives, the old conservatives opposed involvement in foreign conflicts. So you have Obama, a liberal, who supports widespread involvement in foreign conflicts, and you had Bush, and the first Bush and Reagan and Nixon, if you want to, Ford, of course, part of Nixon, but Nixon, if you want to call him conservative, not really. And I don't know if you can hear what I'm saying right now. I think there's an audio problem, but I noticed when I did the playback on the sound check that I could hear it on the playback, but it may not be, there may be no audio on the live broadcast, and I don't understand why. It's computer issues, but anyway, so foreign affairs, the liberals always supported big involvement in foreign conflicts, and the neoconservatives also support that, because what the neoconservatives really were and are is conservative liberals is the term I use, conservative liberals. So Reagan, let's backtrack. Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, Bush, and the second Bush would be considered conservative liberals, although I don't even think anyone really, and really no one would consider the second Bush or even the first a conservative. You know, they were more like, people say moderates, but you know, they were liberals really. But now let's go to the old right, which is a very small group today. But the old right traces its history back to the original liberals. Yes, the original liberals who supported free enterprise in the late 1700s. Adam Smith, Edmund Burke, these types of people. They wanted limited government, individual rights, free enterprise. Frederick Bastiat of France, there's another good example. So the old conservative movement, and they very strongly opposed involvement in foreign conflicts. You know, George Washington's final speech, we should never involve ourselves in European conflicts. Then we have, and let's forget party now. People are so confused about Democrat and conservative, Republican. We had Grover Cleveland, Democrat president, 1885 to 1889, and then again 1893 to 1897, was probably one of the most arch conservative presidents ever. He opposed any sort of government aid to helpless people or the indigent, poor, or injured in disasters or anything like that. He said the people should support the government, but the government should never support the people, because the people will become dependent upon the government, and the government will take away their rights. He vetoed hundreds and hundreds of bills while he was president. He was abandoned by the Democratic Party in 1896 because the Democratic Party was becoming taken over. At this time was being taken over, not becoming, but being taken over by the liberals. So when Woodrow Wilson was elected in 1913, that was it. The Democratic Party was under the control of the liberals, and it's been more and more so ever since. All right, the Republican Party was started by liberals. The Republican Party in 1854 or 56, depending on when you look at it, was started as a liberal party. People joined the Republicans because by the 1960s, they were just less liberal than the Democrats, which had become more liberals than the original Liberal Party. But to sum it up, the old-time conservatives did not support the New Deal, government programs to help the poor or the homeless or economic recovery or any of those things. The old conservatives always opposed tariffs, interestingly, because the old conservatives felt that tariffs interfered with free trade, which they thought free trade would help the poor or the common man, and that regulated trade was done for the benefit of rich companies. So the old conservatives always promoted free trade and low tariffs, and the big government people tended to support high tariffs, which would protect companies, big companies. And but of course today the Republican Party has abandoned, at one time that was the party of high tariffs, but they've generally abandoned high tariffs. And Democrats and conservatives today favor regulated free trade, not true free trade, which would be no tariffs between any country and just widespread open trade. So the Democrat and Republican parties today have taken a third way, not open trade, which the old-time conservatives always supported, or most of them, and not tariffs either, but regulated. They call it market-based. Now, as far as foreign affairs, a few more things. Civil rights, the old-time conservatives always opposed civil rights legislation because they felt like it interfered with individual rights. So when Franklin Roosevelt was trying to promote civil rights, the old-time conservatives vehemently opposed him. Same thing with Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, down the line till today, 2014. The old-time conservatives would have never supported the Civil Rights Act 1964. They were very opposed to Martin Luther King because he was promoting more government programs, which the old-time conservatives never could stomach. So the old-time conservatives would say, you have a restaurant and you don't want to serve certain people, that's your personal business, that's your individual right to not serve whoever, people with long hair, short hair, maybe you have some fixation against people with hair that's dyed with hair color or whatever. So they would never support that. Now, going on to foreign affairs, the old-time conservatives, if you look at Grover Cleveland, perfect example, were always anti-imperialists. They opposed the U.S. war against Spain in 1898. They opposed the annexation of Hawaii in 1898. They opposed annexing the Philippines, Guam, in all of those areas, interfering in Latin America because they felt generally that the U.S. should stay out of foreign conflicts and keep the military home. They opposed U.S. involvement in World War I. Excuse me, they opposed the U.S. involvement in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War I, Gulf War II, whatever war is going on right now. So the old-time conservatives oppose foreign conflict. So if you asked an old-time conservative today, what is your opinion of World War II? They would have said we should have stayed out of it, not interfered with any of those things, or Germany, Japan, whatever. The new neoconservatives would say, no, we have to be involved. We have to help manage the world, or however they might term it. Collective security, whatever. Interestingly, collective security is a term that the Soviet Union invented. But and you see that today, all the presidents since 1933, all of them have favored widespread U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts. So we have not had an old-time conservative president since at least Calvin Coolidge, and you could make some arguments that he was sort of a middle ground. He had some character of a newer conservative, but he was a little more old guard. And then, of course, Warren G. Harding, who died suddenly, was more old guard. And that's another term that people would use years ago for old-time conservatives, old guard. But really, the last true, staunch, old-time conservative was Grover Cleveland, who opposed foreign intervention in any conflicts, typically, except he did sort of uphold the Monroe Doctrine of not allowing Europeans to colonize Latin America, North or South America. So you could argue he wasn't exactly a Puritan and a paleo-conservative thought, but he was strongly in favor of free markets, extremely limited government. He stayed up in the White House all hours of the night going over bills, and he would write out long essays to Congress of why he was going to veto the bill because it was unconstitutional. He would, Grover Cleveland, a Democrat would have, he opposed federal civil rights laws. He would have strongly opposed the New Deal, Social Security, minimum wage, et cetera, et cetera. So today you basically have a choice with your major candidates between very liberal Obama, somewhat liberal Romney, and a conservative liberal, a liberal that wants a lot of changes, but maybe and wants a lot of U.S. power around the world and U.S. government to be powerful. Maybe not so much. So a conservative liberal like a Reagan. So that's really the main difference between old-time conservatism, which would be like, well, I don't want to get into organizations. I don't want to make this too long, like what organizations would promote which one. We can look at that later. But anyway, the old-time conservatives and the new-time conservatives. And we can look at liberal later, what makes up that modern old-time and whatever. So thank you for watching this video production. I hope the audio is okay. If not, I could always delete it. We'll try it again and see what the problem is there. You run into these problems sometimes. Thank you.